East and West Learning Connections
helps people of different cultures break barriers and connect with each other.
Together, let's make learning and connections happen.
Together, we make cross-cultural learning and connections happen.
Okay, let's start. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to East and West Learning Connections. My name is Yang Wang. I'm the president of the organization and your moderator tonight. For those of you who are the first time to be here, let me introduce ourselves a little bit. We are a federally registered organization based in Toronto, Canada. And we organize both in-person and online events to promote cross-cultural learning and communication among people of different heritages. We are totally run by volunteers. And in the past 8 years, we have organized more than 320 cultural events like tonight for the public for free and tons of activities for our registered members. We want to help people of different heritages break cultural barriers and connect with each other. If you like the idea, we invite you to join us either as a member or a volunteer or donor, very important, or just let your friends know about us so more people can benefit from our programs. We wish together we could do something big or small to make learning and connections happen instead of fears or hostility or separation, polarization. Tonight, we are very much honored to be joined by an award-winning author and journalist for The New Yorker, Mr. Peter Hessler, known by many Chinese by the name He Wei. Peter graduated from Princeton University, majoring in English, and later he studied English language and literature at University of Oxford in Britain. Later, for almost 20 years, he lived in China and Egypt. First as a Peace Corps English teacher in China, then as the New Yorker's correspondent in the two countries, respectively. And he wrote numerous articles and books about the contemporary societies of the two countries by examining the lives of ordinary people. His trilogy of nonfiction books about China, River Town, Oracle Bones, and Country Driving were all New York Times bestsellers. And Oracle Bones was named a finalist for the National Book Award in 2006. When he was in Egypt, he covered the events of the Egyptian Arab Spring for The New Yorker. And his book about Egypt, The Buried, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2019. In 2019, he and his family returned to China, and he taught nonfiction writing at Sichuan University, and his twin daughters attended a local public school. His latest book, The Rivers, is about their experience in China in that period of time during the pandemic. And very proudly, our social reading club read it right after it was published in 2024. Peter is admired by many people, not only for his intriguing writing skills and insight, but also for his courage to stay true, even though sometimes it could cause troubles and criticism from both sides in a political conflict. Tonight, we're not talking about politics, but we very much look forward to hearing Peter's cross-cultural living experience and his thought on how to manage cultural difference and conflict, political conflict in this fast-changing world. Thank you so much for coming, Peter, and a warm, warm welcome on behalf of all of our audience. Um, Peter will give a short presentation followed by an interview by our co-host tonight, Dr. Fei Song and Mr. Ed Shiller. Fei is the graduate program director and professor of human resource management and organizational behavior at Toronto Metropolitan University. And Ed is a retired journalist for the New York Times, Reuters, the Toronto Star, and many other prominent news media. He's also an author and a publisher. Actually, Ed came to East and West Learning Connections last year as a guest speaker himself. And you can watch our dialogue with him on our YouTube channel. And you are welcome to read a very interesting article by Ed on our website in the blog area on his experience and reflection on the topic of racism. Thank you very much, Faye and Ed. I'm so happy that you can come to co-host tonight's dialogue with Peter. And last but not least, I want to thank our volunteer team, Adrita, Frank, and Jan, for providing technical support for tonight. Thank you very much for your time and your commitment to this organization always. Finally, to our audience, welcome again. And I would like to ask you to please kindly mute yourself during the talk and the interview. If you have any questions for Peter, please send them to the chat room. And our volunteer team will select some typical questions to ask Peter on your behalf. We will try to cover as many as possible, but due to time limit, we may not be able to cover them all. My apologies for that. But at the very last of this evening, I'll invite all of you to unmute yourself and turn on your video to have a direct conversation with Peter if that's what you wish. Okay, right now, without further ado, I'll give the time to Peter.
Hi, no, thank you, Young, and thanks to everybody who has come tonight. I'm talking to you from southwestern Colorado, where I live with my family. We are in spring now, and I've had a little bit of allergies, so you may see me wiping my nose and maybe sneezing occasionally because we've hit the high allergy season. I wanted to start. I mean, most of this is going to be a conversation, but I thought I would begin a little bit by giving an introduction to how I first went to China back in the 1990s. I graduated from university in 1992. As Young mentioned, I was an English major in creative writing. Actually, in those days, I planned to become a novelist. I wanted to be a fiction writer. Although I did take one class in nonfiction writing. But I had no interest at all in China, actually. And for my generation, that was pretty common. It was more common for students to study Japanese, for example, than Chinese. And I mean, I was aware of things in China in my freshman year was 1988 to 1989. So it was at the end of that year that Liu Se and the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. So of course I was aware of that, but it wasn't something that I thought about. I never took a course in Chinese language or literature or history or anything. And so really it was sort of by chance that I ended up in China. I had always been interested in joining the Peace Corps. And I applied to join the Peace Corps in 1998. And it turned out that that was not long after they had opened a program in China. And this was a big endeavor. It was a big deal for the United States to be able to send Peace Corps volunteers to China. Because in the 1960s and 1970s, when the Peace Corps was a young organization, there was a lot of propaganda in China against the Peace Corps, saying that it was the Americans would send young people to the developing world to try to make the world capitalist and to try to make it on America's side, which was to some degree was true. It's true that the Peace Corps did start as a Cold War project. It did have this history. But anyway, so the U.S. had tried to get the Peace Corps into China for years, and they first were approved actually in 1989. And the first group of volunteers were training in the summer of 1989, and they had to cancel that program after the massacre happened. But afterward, both sides continued the dialogue, and they decide let's try to restart this when the time is right. And finally, in 1995, the first group of Peace Corps volunteers was sent to China. And I was part of the third group of volunteers. I'm going to show you um, an image of some images as I talk. So let's see. So this is a picture of my Peace Corps group. We were sent in the summer of 1996. It was a small group. There were only 14 of us. You can see that all of us are quite young, except for one volunteer who was older. And actually, none of us had ever studied Chinese language or literature or history or anything. I mean, so it was a group of people who were completely new to the country. We went to Beijing very briefly, just on the way in, but the Peace Corps base was in Sichuan. And at that time, Sichuan included Chongqing, what's now Chongqing as well. You can see there on the lower right the map of Sichuan and Chongqing at that time. And the Peace Corps headquarters was based in Chengdu. And it's kind of interesting, why was it based in Sichuan? The main reason was Deng Xiaoping. Because when the Peace Corps wanted to get into China, they knew that it would be more likely to meet with approval from Chinese officials if there was a connection to Deng Xiaoping. And so they decided to try to be based in Sichuan. It also worked well because there was a consulate there in Chengdu. But it turned out that was very fortunate because Sichuan in some ways was a really representative place to be. It was much better than being in Beijing or Shanghai where there's so many foreigners. Most of us were sent to very small places where there usually were no other foreign residents. And so it gave us the opportunity to learn about China very intensely. I was sent to a small place called FuLing, which is on the Yangtze River in what is now Chongqing. At that time, again, was in Sichuan. All of the Peace Corps volunteers were teachers, and I was actually given the project of teaching English literature, which was perfect because I had studied literature both at Princeton and at Oxford. That's a photograph of me teaching in the fall semester of 1996. Before going to FuLing, we had 2 months of training. And so the Peace Corps gave us an intensive course in Chinese. But as many of you will know, the Chinese that was spoken in 1996 in a place like FuLing is not the same as the Chinese that's spoken, in Beijing or spoken in Mandarin. So that was an enormous adjustment. Like for example, if you're talking in Mandarin and you say 吃饭, in Sichuan it's 吃饭. And so as a young person, you had to learn to sort of deal with both the language and the dialect. And that was an enormous challenge, especially in the early months. Even my name was a little different. In Mandarin it was He, but the Sichuanese would say He. Was kind of the way that they said it. So that the tones changed, and it took a long time to get used to these things. As I mentioned, I had never lived in China before. It was all new to me, and none of my students had ever met an American before. And so it was it was that first semester in particular was very intense interaction. You can see the picture there. We taught in pretty small classrooms. We usually had 45 to 50 students in the classroom. And the students watched us very intently. It was me and one other young American. His name was Adam Meyer. We were sent there to FuLing together, and this was, as I said, the first time that any of those students had met an American. And pretty early in my teaching, I received an essay from a student whose English name was Richard, and in my writing class. And Richard's essay had the title, "Why Americans Are So Casual." And Richard, in this essay, he wrote, "I'm a Chinese. As we all know, the Chinese nation is a rather conservative nation. So many of us have conservative thinking in some degree. I don't know whether it is bad or good. Our foreign language teachers, Peter and Adam, came to teach us this term. It provides a good opportunity of understanding the American way of life. In my opinion, they are more casual than us Chinese people. Why do I think so? I'll give you some facts to explain this. For example, when Mr. Hessler is having class, he can scratch himself casually without paying attention to what others may say. He dresses up casually, usually with his belt dropping and dangling. But to tell you the truth, it isn't considered a good manner in China, especially in old people's eyes. In my opinion, I think it's very natural. You can see from that's another picture there of me teaching in the classroom. I realized later that even walking away from the teacher's podium like this and walking in the middle of the students, that was very unusual in a classroom. You know, the teachers tended to be quite formal in a place like FuLing, and they would stay behind the podium. And when Adam and I walked in the classroom, the students found that unusual. Richard's essay continued when he talked about last week when Miss Thompson, who was another Peace Corps volunteer, gave us a lecture on the American election. She took off her woolen sweater and tied it to her waist. To us Chinese people, it's almost unimaginable. But thanks goodness, we major in English and know something about America. It didn't surprise us. But if other people saw this, they might can't believe their own eyes. So we realized very early that we were being watched very carefully, and it was very easy to make mistakes, in a new culture, in a place that had not seen a lot of outsiders. But people tended to be quite forgiving, and there was a lot of humor, just like in Richard's essay. There was a good sense of humor there. The other picture that you see there is the FuLing students watching the handover of Hong Kong. So a couple of big things that happened during my first year there. One was that Deng Xiaoping died in the first spring of my first academic year. And then the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. And you can see that the students gathered in the classroom at midnight and they watched in this tiny TV there. I mean, that's the kind of, there was very little technology at that time. Um, the students, all of my students were majoring in English, and this was a teacher's college, and so they were training these students to learn English and to learn how to teach, and then they were going to send them back to their home regions to teach in middle schools and high schools, and this was all part of a project to expand education and improve education in China, and in particular to improve contact with the outside world. So this was very much in the spirit of 改革开放, Deng Xiaoping's projects, reform and opening, trying to open to the outside world. That was one of the main reasons why they admitted people like me and Adam to teach there, and it was why our students were studying English. Um, it was very unusual at that time for a Chinese person to go to college. Only one out of every 12, 8% would go to any kind of tertiary educational institution. Um, and this, if you're talking about the definition of higher education, this was what you would call elite, which means that fewer than 15% of your population gets to go to college. It was very unusual. So and so these students had an unusual opportunity, but very few of them, almost none of them, had been privileged. Almost all of them had grown up on the countryside, and of course that was very common at that time. Most of my first cohort of students had been born in 1974, and at the time they were born, China's population was 83% rural. And so virtually all of my students had grown up on farms. And these, of course, were very small farms in Sichuan province. And they were often living, near the poverty level. And even when you went out the back gate of the college, you would see the sort of terraced rice fields like in that picture. That's right next to the college. So we were very much aware of the countryside when we lived there as teachers, and especially from our students. The students talked about their villages a lot, their families. Many of the students had parents who were illiterate. You can see the boy on the left there. His English name was Mo, and he had come from a very poor part of Sichuan province. He was the first from his village to make it into college, and both of his parents could not read. And they had attended almost no schooling at all as children. That was a common background. You notice that he's wearing his suit coat with the label on it. That's what people wore in those days in Sichuan province, and he's smoking a cigarette. And Mo actually was not a smoker. He just used that to pose for the picture, because Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders often posed with cigarettes in their photographs. So sometimes my students would do that. All of my students had chosen English names. His name was Mo. And at a certain point, our second year, when we got to know these kids quite well, Mo and others said, "Well, why is it that you have a proper Xing? You have a proper Chinese family name, He Wei, but we only have a first name." And so some of these students began to develop their own English surnames. So one of my students who was named Willie, suddenly he became William Foster, and then he became William Jefferson Foster. Another boy named George became George Baker Frost. They sort of chose these very waspy English names. And Mo became Mo Money. That was his English name, Mo Money. And he was actually a Communist Party member. But he was also the Banzhang, the class monitor. So we had this very intense connection with them, got to know them very well. And, you know, they often talked about their village and so on, but to be honest, they didn't say that much about how difficult things had often been in their lives. And it wasn't really until years later that I often understood that many of them had really dealt with fairly serious poverty. China was still a pretty poor country, especially in Sichuan province in the 1990s. It wasn't until 2017, 20 years after I taught, that I received a letter from a student named David. And David, in his letter to me, he apologized for not having been a very good student. And to be honest, there was nothing wrong with David, but I do remember he didn't have a lot of energy, and sometimes he would fall asleep in class. But in his letter, he wrote to me and he said, "For 3 years, I did not eat and sleep well. I remember in 1996, for half a year, I just had one meal a day. I was a sad man, but now I am happy about my life." So those were some of the things that we didn't really understand until later. Sort of the degree of challenges that they had had, the degree of poverty that many of them had faced. But you could even tell just, from the way that they looked, most of the students would wear the same clothes every day, actually. In the early part of the way I memorized students' names was through their outfits because they didn't change their clothes very often because everything had to be washed by hand. They had to wash everything themselves. And there were no washing machines. And so you would get to know them by what they wore. You can also see in this picture, that's me there on the front on the left. And it looks like I'm very tall, but in fact, I'm only 5 foot and about 5'9". And that's because most of these students were quite small. These were people who hadn't eaten a whole lot when they were younger. So the 2 years there were sort of an amazing experience, first teaching these young people, but also studying Chinese and learning what life was like in a place like FuLing. By the end of the 2 years, because there were no other foreigners there, it was actually very good for studying Chinese. There wasn't anything else to do. And in those days, we didn't have an internet connection. So really, my entire life was very much focused on FuLing. I had no phone. Nobody from the US could call me. I would get letters occasionally in the post, but nothing on internet or email. So I studied Chinese very diligently. And one thing that I did before I left that I was always grateful for is you see these two pictures there to the right is I gave the students a book and I asked them all to write their addresses in this book. Um, and you can see Jimmy on the right wrote his address, Kathy wrote hers. And I realized that I wanted to stay in touch with them. And in those days, you couldn't really do this any other way other than letters. And so initially, I thought it was going to be hard because I was going back to the United States, and I knew that it cost a lot to send a letter to the U.S. I think it was about the equivalent of $1, and most of these students were making something like $30 or $40 a month as teachers in their first jobs. Um, but I ended up returning to China quite soon after I left FuLing. I returned in the spring of 1999 to Beijing to become a journalist. So once I was there, it became quite easy to stay in touch. They would write me letters, and I would send a letter every semester to all of my students using these addresses. And they often wrote back. They had their new lives. Most of them were working as teachers, and we would correspond about all kinds of things. And over the years, I collected just hundreds and hundreds of letters. If anybody who was in China in the 1990s would recognize these kind of envelopes that you see in the picture when people would rely heavily on letters. Here in my home in Colorado, I have a huge file cabinet that's just full of these letters. In the early part, like most people from rural China, they tended to marry quite young. And one of the things that I often corresponded with them about in the first years after I left was about their courtships and their marriage. For example, there was one student who wrote me in December 20th, 2000, and she wrote, "Last winter, I was married with a doctor. He is not very handsome, but he is very kind to me. Next spring, we will have a baby." Another student wrote in in November of 2004, "What makes me happy is that I married an ugly woman who graduated from the math department of FuLing Teachers College." Another student wrote in 2000, "After graduating FuLing Teachers College, my parents and relatives all wanted to introduce girlfriends to me. Some were also very beautiful, but when they saw me, they at once went away and left a word. The toad wants to eat the meat of the swan. Now I find a girlfriend finally. She will be my wife after 2000. She isn't beautiful. There are many black points on her face. But I love her because she has more money than me. Maybe I love her money more. I have many things to say, but I can't write out. This letter is typed from my girlfriend's computer. So it was sort of an amazing experience to be in touch with them. They had great sense of humor. I always laugh when I would get these letters. I always thought of this as a very, very typical rural Chinese approach was to be very modest about anything good. If something good happened, you don't want to take too much obvious pleasure in it. It might bring bad luck or it might seem immodest. So they would always say, "Oh, I married an ugly woman," or "My husband is very unattractive." That was just the way that people would present their lives. Um, so over the years, I stayed in touch, and over time, this correspondence developed into something deeper, and I started to send out surveys. And so I would often survey them about their lives. Like, every year I would write them a letter, but I would also ask them questions about different things. One year I asked them questions all about religion and faith and sort of their attitudes on that. Another year I wrote them about education, questions about education, their opinions of education. And I often asked them questions about their economic situation as well. Just to try to see how their lives had changed and to sort of quantify things a little bit. And this was really useful for me as a journalist and also a very good way to stay in touch and to understand their lives. Um, to give you a sense of how their lives were being transformed, um, when they started teaching, they usually had a salary of about $500 a year. That, and in Sichuan province, you could live okay on that. It wasn't a lot of money, but you could live on that. When I surveyed them in 2014, so that's 15, 16 years after they graduated, that salary, the median household income had risen from $500 to 18,000. And when I surveyed them 7 years later, it had almost doubled to $35,000. I surveyed them last fall and it was 37,300. So it was sort of amazing how quickly their lives changed. I mean, as I had mentioned, they were born often into poverty. Their families had no tradition of education. They didn't have any advantages in that sense, but their timing was really amazing. They were sort of a special generation because they were born right around the time that Kaifang started, that the reforms started. That means that they grew up with these changes and they were able to experience these improvements. When I would go back, this picture there is from a visit that Adam and I made to FuLing. I believe that was 2017 or 2018. And you can see that all of these people who I remembered as being rural people, who wore the same clothes, who washed their clothes by hand, now they were very much urban middle class. They've all got their iPhones there. You can see Mo Money there to the left. So it was really sort of amazing to witness this transformation. So over the years, I stayed in touch with them, but I always had the idea that I would like to go back and spend more time with them personally and interview them about what their experiences have been like. But I was also interested in teaching again in the province, in the region. So I had the idea that I would return after about a period of 20 years because I figured that's kind of like a generation. And that way I could teach the sort of the next generation. And it turned, so I returned with my family in 2019, which was 21 years after I went to Chengdu for the first time. And I wasn't able to teach in FuLing, but I taught in Chengdu at Sichuan Daxue, at Sichuan University, which is also in the region. Um, and so I lived in Chengdu, but I would often make trips to FuLing to visit my former students. And I also, I taught English and writing in journalism at Sichuan University. And it was really an amazing experience to see these changes. As I had mentioned in 1996, when I first taught, 8% of Chinese would go to college. By the time I went back in 2019, it was 51.6%. So when we talk about those stages of higher education, which are elite, mass, and universal, China had passed through all of them in one generation. Which is really hard to grasp. That first semester I taught at Sichuan University, I did not have one student from the countryside. Everybody had grown up in a city. Um, but almost everybody was an only child. More than 90% of them were only children. Whereas in FuLing, most of those students in FuLing had come from big farm families. Often they had 3 or 4 siblings. But by the time I came back, these were urban kids, growing up in the city, growing up usually as the only child. They were really the same age as as the children of my students. Um, the students in FuLing, actually one of them, many of them had students in college the same time. I had children who were in college by the time I returned. And one of my FuLing students actually had a son who was at Sichuan University while I was teaching there. So this sort of expansion of education I think, is really a hard thing to understand. To give you some context on that, you can look at the number at the bottom. When I taught in FuLing, when I left in 1998, the college had 2,000 students. And in 2004, only 6 years later, they expanded to more than 20,000. And I think there's probably never been a society that has expanded higher education, certainly not a society with the population, with a large population that has been able to expand higher education at this sort of pace. And that happened at almost all the colleges that Peace Corps volunteers taught at. Almost all of them, increased their enrollments by tenfold. So that was really amazing. You also sort of notice the differences. Like I would often, when I taught these students in Sichuan University, I would show them this picture from FuLing, and I would say, how is it that I got so much shorter? Because if you notice from this picture, a lot of these kids are taller than me. Um, and that was something else that had really changed. In 2020, a study in the Lancet, the medical journal, reported that out of 200 countries, China had seen the largest increase in boys' height and the third largest in girls' height since 1985. And the average Chinese 19-year-old male is now more than 3.5 inches taller. So this is something that you really notice when you're there as a teacher. I mean, I remembered those days in Sichuan when everybody was small, people had not been fed well, and now suddenly these kids who are big, and a lot of them are bigger than me. These pictures here are FuLing students with their sons, and this is often the case. You can see their children are so much bigger than them. They've grown up in the city. The nutrition is so much better, and it looks like sometimes it looks like they're not even related because it's so you know the difference is so abrupt. So anyway, this was my project when I returned to China in 2019 with my family. So I just wanted to give you that as sort of an early introduction to what I was doing when I went back. And now I'd like to switch over and open it up to the questions and any questions that you might have. Yeah, for Ed and for Faye. Yeah.
Sure, I'll start, Peter. Thank you so much for such a wonderful and incredible presentation with all the footage of those amazing photos. That was indeed extremely interesting. So my question, the first question is, what are some biggest challenges when adjusting to a new culture, and what are the best strategies to overcome such challenges since you've traveled so much over the years? Anything to share?
Yeah, I mean, in FuLing, of course, it was very intense initially because the Peace Corps did give us classes on how to adjust, and we had 2 months to train in Chengdu before we were in the classroom, and so they tried to warn us about things that might be a problem or things that we needed to avoid, maybe topics that were sensitive, other things like that, and so we had some preparation, but at the same time. It's impossible to be prepared all the time, right? I mean, there's so many little things that you can do when you're going to a new place. I can remember must have been the first week when the students were introducing themselves. Adam, the other teacher, had each of the students stand up and introduce themselves. And of course, the students are very nervous when they do this. They've never seen an American before, and now they have to stand up and say their English name. And the students often had very good written English, and they were good at reading English, but they had rarely spoken it much, so many of them were very uncomfortable. And of course, Chinese students are often shy, especially if they're coming from the countryside. So one of the students stood up and she introduced herself. Her name was Keller, and she said where she was from. And then Adam said, "Thank you, Keller. You have very nice freckles." Um, and the moment he said it, the entire class just went really silent. Like everybody was just totally silent. And Adam realized, uh-oh, I think I just said something wrong. And of course, in China, freckles are not considered attractive. In America, they often are. And this poor girl was mortified, and some of the students wrote about it in essays, and they said, in China, we don't make comments about people's appearance. And so it was just, there were a lot of awkward moments like that where we had to try to get past mistakes that we made. We made a lot of mistakes early on. Part of it was, you had to have a sense of humor. I think that always helps. You had to be able to laugh at yourself. We were trying to talk to people in Chinese, and initially it was very hard, in part because of the dialect. And so it took time, and you had to be good humored about that. And I think also a lot of it was you couldn't follow the same expectations that you might have. For example, in America, we like to have the tradition where you're teaching a class and you call on a student and the student stands up and answers the question. But we learned that that didn't work very well in China because if the student didn't know, all of the people around the student would kind of whisper the answer to him or her. And some of the Peace Corps teachers got very frustrated like this, and they would sort of lecture the class, "Don't tell her the answer. I need to see if she knows." But we realized very quickly it's a different classroom dynamic. And these kids spend so much time together, and they get so mortified if you put them on the spot like that, that of course their classmates are going to try to help them out. So you had to find a different way to interact with them. You couldn't follow the same patterns that you would in the United States. So a lot of it was about flexibility.
Thank you.
Hi, Peter. It's a great
Hi.
pleasure to meet you here face to face and to listen to your talk. Um, I would like to deal with our mutual perceptions culturally. I think that in my experience, we have perceptions of other cultures that are often based on stereotypes and preconceptions and misinformation. In your experience, what are some of the stereotypes that, say, Canadians or Americans would bring to China or have of the Chinese? And what are some of those stereotypes that the Chinese would have of, say, people in the West, or in particular Canada and the US?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of interesting. I mean, I think in some ways we were almost fortunate that we had not thought that much about China before we went there. 'Cause I actually feel like many of the people in my group didn't have incredibly strong stereotypes. Like I think we were probably fairly flexible because this was just a new place, and a lot of us had never thought about going to China. And suddenly in May, they got a note from the Peace Corps saying we're going to send you to China, and then you go, right? And you have no idea at that time how this is going to transform your life. I mean, I ended up spending a lot of my adulthood there. My wife is Chinese American, my kids are Chinese, they speak Chinese. So it really transformed my life, but you didn't know at the start, right? And so I think it almost helped not to have very strong preconceptions. Of course, there was an idea that China is a very, everybody knows China is a communist country. It was, it was seen generally in the West as very repressive, very authoritarian, still quite poor at that time. I think there were a lot of things that didn't get captured in the American media at that time. It was very hard to capture the sense of movement, the idea that people were transforming their lives, that things were really changing. I don't think that had really become part of the consciousness in the United States yet. And that was one of the good things about being on the ground. Just being in those classrooms with those kids, you could tell like these people's lives are being transformed. They are being turned into totally different people than their parents were. And even at the legal level, for example, everybody knows the Chinese had the hukou, the residence permit. And in those days, the same thing now, if you were from rural China and you went to college, your hukou immediately became a city hukou. So these people went from being rural people suddenly to officially, legally urban people. And you could tell like this is where they're going. These people are going to become something different. They're becoming educated, and they were also so grateful for the opportunity to learn that it was a very easy place to teach in many ways, because the students were very appreciative. I mean, these were people who were not spoiled. They knew that it was a rare opportunity to go to university, and so I always appreciated that, and I thought it was really a very special moment to be teaching there. In terms of how they thought of Americans, I mean, there was all kind, in those days without the internet, there was, the information was very limited and would be very strange. Like, they had, like we had a book about America and American culture that our students that was a government published book, and it had like a section on social problems. And there was a big part of this section on social problems that was about homosexuality and how in America, because people are capitalist, some of them become gay. And so this was the sort of thing in this was in the textbook that we were supposed to teach from. And of course, Adam and I didn't teach from it. We, we avoided all of that. But the students would often believe these things because that's what they had been told, and there was very limited other information. And of course, their contact was very low. I had one friend who taught. He was also sent with another volunteer to teach in a place called Neijiang, also in Sichuan province, and he was left-handed, and that's a really unusual thing in China, right? Nobody in China writes with their left hand. And if you were an American and you wrote with your left hand on a chalkboard, you would always hear like the first time you would hear the students all t talking, like they were, wow, he's using his left hand. And so they had two volunteers. One of them was left-handed, one of them was right-handed. And at one point, he asked his students, "What percentage of Americans do you think are left-handed?" And they said 50%. There's like that was their sample group was these two volunteers, and so you kind of represented everything. Like Adam and I were both quite athletic. We played basketball. I went running every day. And the students were like, "Oh, this is just what all Americans are like this. They do sports all the time." And so you would get these certain ideas about America from these two people, and so you were very conscious of that. Like I'm representing an entire culture to these young people. And I'm trying to like guide them a little bit and help them understand which things may not be represented. But it was definitely a big project.
Can I ask a follow-up? You mentioned about the the idea of, say, capitalism making people gay, for example. Um, and this obviously is some form of official uh, sort of dogma about it. Um, did you in the class then sort of take a different approach and explain it differently? And if you did, were there any repercussions?
It's very hard at that time. Like we learned that it was better not to just don't like you could. First, we tried showing them this thing in the textbook and saying, this is not right. This is wrong. But that really confused them. They're like, well, this is in the book. Like, why would there be something wrong in the book? So we realized that it was better just not to talk about it in a way. Don't use the book. So we just tried to avoid that textbook as much as possible. That was the only solution. So yeah, but things like that were very hard. It was very difficult to talk about, but it's amazing how much that changed. For example, I mean, by the time I went back to Chengdu in 2019, Chengdu, as some people call it, Gaydu, because it's known for being quite open to gay culture, and there's gay bars, and I had students who were openly gay who talked about it. So in one generation, things like that had changed to a significant degree. But you couldn't expect to change people's ideas, just by telling them. Like I couldn't stand in front of the classroom in FuLing and say this book is wrong. And this is the way it is. You had to take smaller steps, basically.
So following on that question, are there conversational topics that are considered completely acceptable and fine in the United States, but would be considered faux pas in China or in Egypt with your traveling experience, and vice versa? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's always all kinds of things. Of course, before we went in the Peace Corps, we were told not to talk about the three T's, which was like Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen, Liusi. So we were told never to bring those things up in class. You learned if you mentioned something like even the Opium Wars, it would make students very uncomfortable to hear a foreigner say that. This was back in the 1990s. But at the same time, there's lots of things that the Chinese were very comfortable talking about. Like if you were a foreigner, in Sichuan, the first thing people would say is "你是哪国人," "你是哪国人," which means, which country are you from? What's your nationality? You say, "Oh, I'm American." "Oh, 美国人." And then the second question was usually, "What's your salary? How much money do you make?" Which of course is not a question you would ask in the United States, right? When you first meet somebody. And sometimes that made volunteers uncomfortable, but I actually really liked it because it meant that I could also ask them questions about money and, how much they made or how much things cost. And they were very comfortable. So that was a really, that was nice. So you kind of, in each culture, you figure out what thing it is that you can talk about. And there's no reason to try to talk about the things that make people nervous. Like, for example, in Egypt, the first question was the same, what country are you from? But the second question was a dinik. dinik, which means what religion are you? That would often be the number two question, like if you're in a cab in Cairo, which you can imagine no Chinese would ever ask that as the second question, right? It's a topic you don't really want to talk about very early in China. But in Egypt, that was very, very early in a conversation. And so you had to sort of say which religion you were. You couldn't say, I don't believe in God. They would find that totally crazy. I always said, well, I'm the Messihi, I'm Christian, and I was raised Catholic. But Leslie, my wife, who was not raised with religion, she learned that she had to also say that she was Christian because otherwise it just got too messy when you're talking with people. So you sort of make these adjustments. And it's funny because when we first went to Egypt, there was one time when I was buying like some water on the street and I thought the price was kind of high. So I started bargaining with the guy. Um, and if you were in China in the 1990s, especially as a foreigner, you learned to bargain. Like it was very important. Like I often say it was like a sport. Like people were very intensely focused on prices and on money. And as a foreigner, they were often trying to charge you more, and you had to have your wits about you and you had to be willing to bargain. So I'm bargaining with this guy in Egypt, and we're just kind of getting started. He's giving me a price, I give him another price, he gives a price, but then very quickly he gets very upset, and he sort of looks up and he goes, "La ilaha illallah," which means there is no God but God, there is no God but Allah, um, because that's something that you say if you're trying to calm yourself down. It's the opening words of the Quran, and so basically he was so upset because I was bargaining. In Egypt, you don't want to deal with money this intensely. So it was very different from China. Whereas in China, nobody would get offended if you're trying to bargain, right? It's just part of the thing people do. So you learn to make these adjustments, and it's part of the interesting part of living in a new place is figuring out what do people like to talk about, what do they not like to talk about.
I'd like to keep pursuing actually on this line because of the differences. I noticed when in my travels, even to European countries, there are certain behaviors, that are acceptable there that are not acceptable. Um, in that vein, what kinds of questions would they ask about life in the United States, in Colorado, say, or in Canada? What sort of curiosities did they have? What were the areas that they really like to explore more than others?
Yeah, I mean, this of course, was different in the 1990s. I wasn't from Colorado at that point. I was from Missouri. Not that they really knew much about these places, but they often asked a lot about money. So they would, is everybody rich in America? Is it true that everybody there? That was the perception in the 1990s. I remember sometimes when I would walk, I'd go for hikes in the countryside, beautiful terraced fields, the rice fields that I showed a picture of earlier. I would walk, and once my Chinese was good enough, I would talk with the farmers. And a question that's a number of them asked me at different times is like they said, I heard that in America they plant their crops with airplanes. Is that true? It's very hard to explain because yeah, there are places where they will drop seeds, but I mean the vision they had is like, you're a nomad, you're a farmer in America, and you just have your plane, right? And you go get your plane, and then you're flying over your fields and planting your rice or whatever, and so often it was very hard to explain these things, and I was often I tried to push people away from extremes, right? I mean, some people would see America as like a paradise or everybody's rich, and other people would see it as like a hellhole where there's crime everywhere and everybody has a gun, and you're trying to kind of guide them to something that's a little more reasonable and more representative. But it was definitely a challenge. But they would ask about things like that. They would often ask, why are you here? Why is it that you're after they asked about your salary, and I would tell them I was making 1,000 kwai, which is $120, and they would be like, "What's wrong with you? Why would you come here why aren't you working in America where you could make more money?" It was often confusing to them, why you would do that, and of course also that I was 27 years old and I was not married. They would find that they found that very strange. It turned out that I made it to 38, 39 without getting married. They found that even stranger.
I just think the pursue thing, it seems that a lot of the focus, at least then, was on money. Does that indicate in their minds some sense of dissatisfaction with their quality and level of life there?
Yeah, I mean, part of the, there's a chapter, the book that I wrote about those years is called Rivertown, and there's a chapter that's just called Money, which is about sort of the meaning of money in people's lives and them, the way they talked about it, the way it became part of your life. I mean, it was intense because they're improving so quickly, right? I mean, as I told you, these students who made $500 a year turned into 18,000 and then 36, so this was going on all the time that I was there, and people were very conscious of the opportunity. You had to be very aware, like very sharp. And the people that were sharp and took opportunities, they became rich. And some of the people that I taught became unbelievably wealthy. I mean, multi-million, tens of 20s, even $100 million, because if you grabbed your opportunity, you could make a fortune at that time. I mean, all this construction everywhere, the economy was booming. So it was very much on people's minds. Money was always there. It was something people always talked about.
So following on that, and it was a very interesting experience. I thought it was like incredible that you first went to China in the 1990s, and then 30 years later you went back. So you kind observed and witnessed two generations of students. And you mentioned that in your first time in the 90s, students asked you questions about money. They were very open about talking about money issues. And 30 years later, of course, many things changed. A lot more students were in the higher education. Post-secondary education became a lot more accessible. And of course, standard of living dramatically improved as well. So for the current generation of Chinese students, did the topics that intrigue them change? What are they interested in now when you taught them recently?
I mean, they're much more sophisticated, right? I mean, so in the 1990s, those students had come from the countryside. They had very limited information. I mean, they were reading whatever magazines they could find, whatever newspapers they could find. By the time I went back in 2019, the young people, they're on the internet, of course, but they also know how to get around the firewall, right? They know how to get around the controls in China, and they could get information of all types. They were very skilled at that. You could see them learning that at the university. Many of my freshman students at Sichuan University did not know how to fanchang, like to get over the wall, to go over the firewall. And they would often ask me, can you show me how to use a VPN, a virtual private network? And I said, well, I've got one, but I paid for it with American credit card before I came here. So I don't think that's going to help. You should talk to an older student. And that's always what they did. The older students would always teach the young students how to do this. It was almost like part of the curriculum. So they were very sophisticated, I found. That was a huge difference. I mean, they had good information. They were quite savvy. I think one of the things I wrote about in this book is I talked about how in the 90s, the students seemed very young. Those kids from the countryside, they often seemed almost like children, like they were teenagers or young teenagers. And there was a part in Rivertown where I said I always had to remind myself that, these are not children. Like these people some of them have been through very difficult things. They've made it to college. They're very impressive. And it's just that they're new to city life, and they often seem young for that reason. Now, when I went back in 2019, I had the opposite impression. I felt like the students seemed very old. There's a part in my new book, Other Rivers, where I describe them as old souls. They seemed older than their years. Of course, they're the same age as the students had been in the 1990s, but because they're sophisticated, they also weren't that idealistic. Like they sort of understood that there were many flaws with the political system in China. There are many flaws with society, but they couldn't change all of these things. And you have to deal with it. They were very realistic, very pragmatic. That was a big difference I found, and also their relation to politics. Like in the 1990s, my students talked about political figures all the time. Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong, those two would come up in class and in students' writings all the time, constantly, constantly. Whereas when I was at Sichuan University, at the end of my 2 years, I thought about it and I realized I tried to go back and think about it, and I couldn't think of a single time in class where a student had mentioned Xi Jinping. They wouldn't bring up his name. there's no point, right? It's just a risk in their view. Why would you ever talk about this? You can get yourself into trouble one way or another. Just don't mess with it. And so that was very striking. That was a big difference. And actually, when I went back and I looked at all the papers I had received at Sichuan University, and I had more than 500 papers that I got, 500 essays, and only 22 of those did the person mention Xi Jinping. Usually in passing, they wouldn't write it. Whereas in the 90s, they talked about these leaders all the time. So the kids at Sichuan University, they just didn't want to deal with politics. That was part of the way they felt old. They felt like this is something we can't change, and let's not waste our time with it, and let's not put ourselves and others at risk.
Thank you.
For my last question, I'll move back to the teaching part of your life there, and I'm just curious that um, the I guess dealing from today's point of view, are there any significant sort of pedagogical differences between China and I can ask about Canada, but you may be more familiar with the US, particularly regarding, the expected outcomes from the students and the student-teacher relationship?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, I would think that I'm looking here to see if I think I have a statistic here that might be useful from my surveys. Let's see if I can find this. Um, I mean, I think the big difference as an American that I often feel is the respect for education, right? I think this was true in the 1990s, and it's still true today. In that this is a very deep tradition in China that you respect your teacher, you respect the opportunity for education, and it's really a fundamental value. And I could see that in the lives of as I said, I taught at a teacher's college in FuLing, and then I stayed in touch with more than 100 of those students I taught for 20, that's been 25 years now. And more than 90% of them are still teaching. And that's really unbelievable, right? I mean, if you took an American cohort of teachers in training in 1998 and you followed them for 25 years, how many would still be teaching today? Not that many, right? I mean, my older sister was a teacher, very, very gifted teacher. She finally quit because she felt like the parents disrespected her so much, and the kids, and nobody would back them up. And I just think, so, as an American, that often frustrates me, the the lack of respect for education. I mean, it's striking for my daughters. My daughters, were twins and they were in the public school in Chengdu. And in the school in Chengdu, if you're a good student, your status is higher. The other kids like you, they respect you. That's the best way to improve your status. In America, if you're a good student, especially if you're a girl at like an average American public school, it's bad for you socially, And it often frustrates my daughters, like the fact that they're good students is a negative in the US, whereas in
Mhm.
China it was always a positive. But that happens to be that they're quite into running like I was. They're distance runners, and so they're good athletes. They're actually good track athletes. And that's where they get their status, they're kind of relieved that they have that because their educational abilities are mostly negative in the eyes of other children. So those differences are really intense. And when I surveyed my FuLing students one year, I asked them to rate their job satisfaction on a scale to 1 to 10, and the average for those who were teaching was 7.9. So they're very satisfied with their jobs, and that reflected, first of all, that those salaries were pretty good. Like they were paid enough. Almost all of them have an apartment and a car, usually without any debt, but they also get respected. And they have status. They have to work hard at those jobs, but they feel like it's rewarding. I think that's the one thing that I would like to see change the most in the U.S. is sort of the respect for education. And I feel like we take it for granted. We have a great higher education system in America, but we're often undercutting it. And at the other levels, we should be respecting, especially the people who teach. We should be paying them more and respecting them more.
Thank you.
So you have traveled extensively and lived in a number of countries for the last few decades. Has that experience changed you permanently in some respect? Have you ever had a sense of like rootlessness or nostalgia?
Well, I mean, it certainly changed me. I mean, when I was in high school and college, I didn't go overseas once. And I didn't have a passport in high school and college, and for my generation, that wasn't, I grew up in Missouri, which is far from any other country, and we didn't have a lot of money. So we didn't, I wasn't going to take a vacation in Europe, and I didn't study any languages in high school with any sort of seriousness. So it just wasn't part of my world, to be honest. And so it was transformed entirely. I mean, when I look at my life, the most important change was not, I mean, going to Princeton was actually a big change because I went to a big public school in Missouri. I mean, in Missouri, a big public high school, and going from there to an elite university like Princeton University, that was a big transition. That was a big change for me. But the biggest change was definitely going to China in the Peace Corps. That's what really changed my life. And when I look back at my life, that's the moment that things went in a different direction. And I think it does, it's bound to change your personality. Studying another language changes your personality, I believe. I mean, I think it made me probably calmer, because if you live in places like China in the 1990s or Egypt during the Arab Spring, like you have to kind of try to stay relaxed. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself nuts, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. You're in these big cities. It's somewhat chaotic. And so you learn to keep calm. And you also, you learn to sort of communicate with people, right? It's very important to learn how to put people at ease, to have conversations. I mean, I think that being in the Peace Corps really trained me as a journalist in a lot of ways because I was constantly interacting with people. So you learn like what are the jokes you can make, what are the things that you can say that make people happy, that make them open up to you.
Thank you. Um, I don't know where Ed is. I'm gonna ask a next question then.
Okay.
So I know your family has traveled with you this last trip to China. Do you think this traveling and living in Chengdu influenced your children as they were growing up? Has this aspect experience kind of in some way constructed their current identity?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very important experience for them. It was very difficult, right? So my daughters, we moved to Egypt when they were one and a, they're twins, Ariel and Natasha, and they moved to Egypt when they were 1.5 years old. So their early life was basically in Cairo in Egypt. And actually many of their first words were in Arabic. They spoke Arabic with their nanny, and that was their world. We left when they were 6 years old, and we never taught them Chinese. So Leslie did not speak Chinese with them in Cairo because both of us were learning Arabic, and we just felt like it was better to be focused on where we were. We always had the idea we wanted our daughters to learn Chinese, but we felt like it would be most efficient just to move there and have them learn in the environment, rather than have us teach. My wife Leslie, Chinese was her first language. She was born in the United States, but she grew up speaking Chinese at home, and her parents were quite strict in that they expected her to respond to them in Chinese. A lot of Meiji Huaran, the parents speak to them in Chinese and then the kid responds in English. Leslie's parents didn't let her do that. So her Chinese was actually very good. So when she went back to China as an adult, she had very good Chinese. But even so, she didn't want to speak Chinese with her daughters because she felt like English is really my language that I'm most comfortable in. I want them to know me as I am. And so that's the way I want our connection to be. And then when we're in Egypt, they can learn it. So our idea was always to go back and give them the opportunity to learn Chinese. So we found a public school in Chengdu that was willing to take them. This school had no other American students, and they didn't have a tradition of taking foreigners, but they agreed. It was kind of very impressive actually that they were willing to take these two American kids in the classroom. And my daughters really spoke no Chinese when they started. And so it was very, very difficult. I mean, the first day I picked them up from school and they were crying and they said, "We can't go back. We don't understand anything. And, we can't go to school here." And I let them calm down and said, "No, you're going to make it. We just have to be patient. We'll keep working at this." And sure enough, the second day they were more calm. After about a week, you could see that they're starting to pick up a lot of things. And even after a month, they're starting to understand. I think the first time that Natasha stood up and read an assignment in Chinese in the school was like maybe after 3 or 4 weeks. And at the end of the first semester, their Chinese was really quite good. And at the end of the first academic year, they were completely at grade level. They could write, read, they were fine. It's unbelievable how quickly that happens at that age. They were 9 years old when we moved there. Really amazing to sort of witness that. Um, but Chinese school is hard, right? It's intensely competitive. It's much harder than American school. I mean, they often had 3 to 4 hours of homework a night. That's very common for a third grader or fourth grader. Even in third grade, when they started, um, at the end of the semester, they would have final exams, and like for your math final exam is 90 minutes long. Can you imagine like third graders have a 90-minute exam for math, 100
Mm.
minutes for UN for Chinese, 90 minutes for English, and 90 minutes for science. I mean, so you learn, they're training them to be able to focus. It's really, really incredible. So that was a challenge, but my daughters, they like school, they like learning, and so they did well with it. But I think it is an incredibly important experience for them. And that Chinese identity is very important to them. When I say Chinese identity, part of it is their parents, um, you know, that they know that their mother's family came from China, but it's also the language that's very important. So even though we live in a part of Colorado where there's no other Chinese people, my daughters have done a very good job of maintaining their Chinese. They have classes with their tutor in Chengdu. She's been incredible about, we have a terrible time difference, right? It's like they will have class like at 7 in the morning here, and it's like 11 at night in Chengdu. But the teacher that they have is so dedicated that she's willing to do this and to help support them. And my daughters, they don't complain. It'll be like a Saturday or Sunday morning. They're getting up at 7 to do Chinese, but they want to do it because it means something to them. They just took the AP exam in Chinese this year as ninth graders. So I really appreciate that. And while they recognize that those years were very hard, that it was a huge transition, they feel proud that they were able to do it, and they feel connected to that language and to the educational system there. So it was a really positive experience for us.
Great.
On that note, I was thinking in my own experience for a while. I spent 5 years in Denmark, mostly as the correspondent for Reuters, but also a stringer for a lot of papers. My son was born there, and at some point we had to make a decision because Reuters was thinking of sending me to other places, and I would speak to other correspondents and how it was for their families. I was going to ask you about it. You more or less answered that question already, saying that they adjusted well. But are there any particular problems with raising a family, moving on a fairly regular basis from one culture and country to another?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of helped that we had children so late. I mean, Leslie and I were 40 when our twins were born. And so actually most of our friends had already had kids, and a lot of our friends in Beijing, we met in Beijing as journalists. A lot of our friends there had already had children. So we kind of saw their experiences and we learned a lot from that. One thing that we learned is that it's very hard to have a connection to the US actually. Um, when you're living overseas for your children. The children often they don't have a home in the US. They don't really know where their root is. And so that became something that we thought about a lot. Before our children were born here in southwestern Colorado, which neither Leslie nor I had grown up here. We had just moved here after we left China in 2007 because we had books to write. We could live anywhere. We said, well, let's go to a small town in the mountains and it's just the two of us. And so we did that. But it turned out that we liked the community and we liked the people here. And so after we moved to Egypt, actually, we decided let's buy some land there and let's make that our home so that our kids know that this is where they're from. So we did that as a very conscious decision, and I'm glad we did. The other thing that we decided was that for their high school years, we would be back in the United States. We felt like, um, of course, you don't want to be in China really for high school because the college entrance examination dominates your high school years. And it's my daughters are not going to go to a Chinese university. They're going to go to an American or probably an American university. So I didn't want them to kind of experience it's a pretty brutal preparation. So it just made sense to be in the U.S. So that was always our plan that during their high school years we would be based in the U.S. And I had certain projects that I put off until now because knowing that I could do them when we're based in the U.S.
Thank you.
In your last book, you talked a lot about your life and your whole family during the pandemic days in China. Um, could you talk a bit more about your experience living through the pandemic in China? And also, that was a period of political tension between the United States and
Yeah.
China, if you could.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was really intense. And I mean, it's kind of funny because, of course, the pandemic started in China, and China was the first place to experience it. But in a way, we were very slow to understand what was going on. And it's because my daughters were, this was kind of the end of December 2019 and January 2020. I was finishing my first semester as a teacher, and my daughters were finishing their first semesters as students, right? And so we were really totally focused on our school routines. And I started to see these reports about, there was something going on in Wuhan, there was a virus, and we just ignored it. Neither Leslie and I had any energy to think about it because we had our hands full with what we were doing. And then suddenly at the end of January, Chengdu shut down. Like so many, like pretty much every city in China. It wasn't quite what they called fengcheng like they did in Wuhan, where they closed the entire city. It wasn't that dramatic, but people stayed inside. They generally did not go out in the street. This was, the end of January of 2020. So at that point, we realized, this is serious. Something big is happening. And almost all of our friends with children left China at that time. We had friends who were at the consulate in Chengdu, and all the wives and children were evacuated. So there was this idea that this disease is happening here, but if you leave China, you're going to be okay, and you're going to avoid it. And we decided to stay. It's partly because Chengdu was already so closed that I couldn't see how we're going to catch any disease because nobody was interacting, right? So I said, I don't think it doesn't seem very dangerous to me. And I'm teaching here and our daughters are in the school. Even if the school is closed temporarily, it's going to reopen. So let's just stay. And so Leslie and I decided not to leave. But it's funny because it turned out that was a very good decision. Because in China, though that early period, I mean, later China made all kinds of mistakes late in the pandemic. But in the early part of the pandemic, they made huge mistakes in Wuhan, of course. But otherwise, most of the cities closed down and there were very few cases. So actually, in the spring of 2020, there was really no way that we could catch the virus. And my daughters were back in school that spring. So while all of their friends in America were doing remote school and having sort of a terrible experience with that, they were back in the classroom, and I was able to travel all around China. I mean, in August of 2020, I went to Wuhan and reported, at the Huanan market and all these places, talked to many people. And that was all very possible to do in the summer of 2020. I was much more mobile. So our experience turned out to be really different from most people's. We didn't have a lot of isolation in that first year. And it turned out that we ended up leaving in the summer of 2021, and that was before things got really bad in China. Like in China, the real problem was late in the pandemic, when the government shut everything down, when it really wasn't necessary. There were already vaccines. It was, they did this much too long. By that time, we were already back in the US. So in a strange way, by being in China early and then going to the US most of the way through the pandemic, we sort of had a pretty non-traumatic experience, but it was very isolating. Like, so my daughters had almost no other foreign friends were still in China at that point. There were none of our friends with kids had stayed in Chengdu. And there were so few foreigners that, like, when I would go out in Chengdu, which of course is a huge city and very cosmopolitan, people would kind of say "Lao Wai, Lao Wai," just like they did in the 1990s, because it was unusual in 2020 and 2021 to see a foreigner even in a big city like Chengdu. So it was a very unusual experience, very, very intense.
Thank you. I think given the time, I think a lot of the audience would love to ask you questions as well. So I'm gonna give it back to our volunteer who has collected a number of questions from the audience tonight.
Yes.
Thank
Yeah. And Ajita, do we have questions from us?
Yes, we do. We have quite a lot, actually. We have about 19 questions so far.
Okay.
Okay. we'll see how much
Do you want me to look at them on the chat, or are you going to choose questions? How do you want to do it?
Adrita can ask questions
Okay. Yep.
of.
I'm kind of going to do at a like a Russian roulette style, basically,
Okay.
like at no particular order. First of all, hi Peter. It's such an honor to meet you. I actually read one of your articles for one of my courses at TMU, so it's quite an honor to be finally meeting you. So my first question to you is, um, about fuel piety, have you realized the big difference between Chinese and Americans, and what's your understanding of it in the States?
Filial piety, you mean like the relationship with the parents? Yeah, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean there is a different sort of commitment to the family. I mean, I notice this a lot with my students. I have many students from Chengdu who went to the United States or Europe or England to study after Sichuan University. But the vast majority of them plan to return to China, and the main reason is that they feel very obligated to be close to their parents in some way. I think this is partly because they're only children. They don't have siblings, so they feel that weight of the family responsibility. But it's also this is a long tradition in China, and it's quite different than the way I live, for example. I mean, I left my home in Missouri to go to university on the East Coast for 4 years, and then I went to England for 2 years, and then I went to China for more than a decade, and then to Egypt, So I didn't feel like I needed to be that physically close to my parents. I'm very close to my parents and we stayed in close touch and I visit them often, but it's different than it would probably be for most Chinese. And it helped make me pretty mobile, I think, in a way. There's an expectation often in America that, it's okay for the kid to go away. And of course, I also had three sisters, so it was a family of four kids, and it's easier to do that when you have other siblings.
Thank you for your answer. The next question is, what reverse culture shock and education did your daughters experience after moving back to the US?
Yeah, there was a lot. I mean, actually, because in China, in the Chinese class, you know, you have to sit with both feet on the ground, upright, and your hands crossed on the desk. And so when they went back to the American school, my daughter Ariel said she kept catching herself doing this, and she would have to remember you don't have to do that. And in China, anytime that you speak in class, you have to stand up, before you talk. And she started doing that in the American class, and she'd have to tell herself, no, you don't have to do that. So that they had a lot of these little things that they noticed. But again, a lot of what I think they found the social stuff is very complicated in America. If you're a girl a teenage girl in America, the social things are very, very complicated. In China, it's quite simple, actually. Like the girls, there isn't sort of the mean girl phenomenon that you have in an American school often, when girls are 13, 14. There's a lot of that in the US, and it's not really part of the Chinese education. So I think they missed that. They also missed the fact that in China, you're respected for being a good student, and they feel like in an American school, you're not as respected. Now, it's different in different places. Like if you go to an elite American school, like especially if you're at a good private school, there is a different dynamic. But if you're talking about the average American public school, um, it's generally not the same kind of value. And I can remember that as a student. Like when I was growing up, I was a good student, but I always tried to hide the fact that I was a good student. I didn't want the other kids to know what my grades were. I didn't want them because it's basically a negative thing, and they call you, what they use, the term they use now is the try hard. So like my daughters they consider them to be tryhards. You can imagine in China that being an insult, right? I mean, in China that would never be an insult that you try hard, right?
Yeah, I can totally imagine. I feel like there's like a huge like cultural difference between how students are treated, or at least like the academic like field. For example, like if you're a good student, then that's kind of like praised high in China, but like in the
Yeah,
Northern American region, it's more like, it's kind of like, oh, you're just trying to be like the teacher's pet
yeah,
or
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of
It's a
like
negative,
that.
and it's always worse for girls, I think. I think it's
Yeah.
like girls are judged more harshly for that. And as I said, my daughters, I mean, one of the things that they're good runners and they're good athletes, and so that helps them. Like that makes it okay, because that's seen as a good thing, an important part of your personality. Whereas in China, nobody would care about that, basically. You know, the kids they're not competitive about sports, they're not into sports in that way.
Yeah. So, when you were talking about your time during the like Peace Corps in China, so did you feel like homesick in the countryside, considering like you would communicate with your family only by mail? And if so, like how did you overcome it? And how did your students feel about you writing about them in your books?
Yeah, so when I was in FuLing, actually, so I left home when I was 19 or whatever and went to Princeton. That was a big transition for me and a big cultural difference. And then in England. I was at Oxford for 2 years. And in some ways, I had more homesickness or difficulty in Oxford. That was when I had to learn to adjust to being overseas, and I often was not very flexible during that experience, and I didn't really enjoy it that much, to be honest. But I realized at the end that a lot of it was my own problem, that I was not open enough, that I had certain ideas about what this place would be like, and I wouldn't change from those ideas. So I learned a lot about how to handle myself in a different situation. And so by the time I went to FuLing, I was 27 years old and I had already lived overseas. And so I think I had a better sense of how to handle it. And so actually in FuLing, there was never a moment when I wasn't happy to be there, actually. It was definitely difficult. There were many difficult times. I was sick a lot. I mean, it was very hard. You feel a lot of pressure in that environment when you were the only foreigner. Every time I went out, there'd be a crowd of people watching me, and that gets kind of exhausting, physically exhausting. And we weren't eating that well. There were a lot of diseases in those days. I mean, I got infected with tuberculosis when I was there. I had all kinds of respiratory problems. The pollution was really terrible in the 1990s. So those things were hard, but there was never a time when I said, I want to go home. I actually didn't feel that. I was very much engaged by it. Like I just felt like part of it was the teaching I could see really served a purpose. But I also liked studying Chinese and I liked living in this city. It felt like an adventure, and it felt like this was a place that had not been, outsiders had not lived there. And I could kind of discover this place and get to know it. And it was my community. So I felt very connected. I didn't feel, I mean, I was obviously a foreigner, but I felt like I was part of the place. And so those are years I remember very fondly, despite the fact that it was challenging. As far as my students have from FuLing have been very generous in letting me write about them. I think it's kind of remarkable, but it's partly because we sort of grew up together in a way. I was not much older than them. Um, and I wrote about them at that time, and they often, it's funny, people like my book about FuLing, Rivertown, has sold more copies in Chinese than it has in English, which I never would have expected. When I wrote that book, actually, I thought Chinese people would hate it, because I wrote about the city being poor, and when Adam read it, it's on the first page. The first page of it says something about it had always been a poor part of Sichuan province. And when Adam read a draft of it, he said, people might be offended. And I thought about it and I said, yeah, I think that's true. But it was true. Like just like when David writes about only having one meal a day, like poverty was a big part of what we were experiencing there. Not necessarily us directly, but the people I was in contact with. Now they were coming out of poverty, and that's what I was writing about. But it was important to be honest about that, I thought. And I sort of thought that Chinese readers would be offended, because in the past, Chinese were very sensitive about foreigners looking down on China. But it was sort of amazing, partly because it took a little bit of time for that book to be published in Chinese. It wasn't published until like 2004, I think it was. No, 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 much later than that. Like 2012, I think, was when Rivertown appeared in Chinese. Um, and by that point, people were kind of nostalgic about that time. They looked back on it and they sort of said, "Yeah, I forgot about these details." Like, now that he writes about the way buses were, I remember that. And so they sort of appreciate it. And they also said, "I didn't have time to write all this stuff down because they were in the middle of it, right? The Chinese they had to deal with all of these adjustments and unbelievable changes. Like I remember my last year in China, my tutor, my Chinese tutor, explained to me like, yeah, our apartments were all given to us by the work unit, but now we have to buy them ourselves, and the college is telling us how much we have to pay, and everything's becoming privatized. And it was like this huge change that just hits people, right? And imagine how stressful that is. You've spent your entire life in this system that's the sort of a classic socialist system, and now suddenly they're adjusting. So people were very much occupied with this. They didn't have a lot of time to write their stories or to record the details. But as an outsider, I could do that. I wasn't in the middle of it in the same way as them. I didn't feel that intense pressure. I wasn't having to buy my own apartment and all this stuff. But I wrote about it, and I was able to record it. And so when those books were published in China, a lot of Chinese readers appreciated that. And I found them in general to be extremely generous. I think it's very unusual. And actually, when I wrote about Egypt, most Egyptians, I think, don't like what I wrote about Egypt. It's a very different relationship with it. I think I wrote in the same kind of way, but people's relationship with the moment is different. And I think China, reached a more confident moment when they could look and see how an outsider was viewing them, and and they found it interesting.
So, coming back to your book, someone asked that how did you like find a publisher who was willing to publish your first book in Chinese? Like, how was that journey for you?
Yeah, it was unexpected. I mean, the publisher approached me. I wasn't looking for it. I had assumed that I didn't think anybody would care. I didn't think anybody would want to publish it. And the first book that was published was actually Country Driving, which became 巡路中国in Chinese, and that was published in 2011, the year I moved to Egypt. And so we had the contract, and it surprised me they were able to publish it. They made some tiny, tiny changes for political reasons, but really nothing important in the book. Um, and so, they published it, and it made me happy because I felt like I've been writing about people in China, and the ones who speak English can read my books, but nobody else can. And I feel more comfortable if people know what I'm writing, if they can read it in Chinese in their own language. But I thought it would be a very small audience. I didn't think very many people would care. Um, and it was interesting because I went in 2011, the publisher said, "Can you come to Beijing and do some book talks?" And I said, "Sure." And Leslie and I were planning to go there right before we moved to Egypt, kind of as a way to see friends before we moved on to the next place. And I went to these book events, and it was unbelievable to me because they were just packed. And it was like all young people. Whereas, like in America, when you go to a book event, if you're giving a book talk, it's all old people, because they're the only people that read. But I would go to these events in China, and it was all young people in their 20s, 30s, 40s. They were intensely interested, and it really shocked me. I mean, I didn't expect that at all. And the book ended up, selling really well, which we had not expected. So it all took me by surprise. I think it was just a moment of timing. I mean, I think if I had written those kind of books 15 years earlier, they wouldn't have been published in China, and people in China probably wouldn't have liked them. So it was sort of a matter of the timing.
Right. So there is one question that has there been a time that you had to overcome your own prejudice slash stereotype towards some people in China and Egypt, or has it never been anything like that for you?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think in both places, like I'm a fairly flexible person. I think my father's a sociologist, so he's in the social sciences, and so he loved he interviewed people. He would do his field work, and he's sort of an unusual person that he loves nothing more than meeting somebody who has totally different ideas than him. And if the person's ideas are kind of offensive, I think he finds that very interesting, and he wants to know why they think this, what do they care about? It doesn't bother him. So I grew up with that environment. I think that really helped shape me. So when I was in Egypt or China and people would say things that maybe go against what I believe, doesn't bother me at all. I'm curious. I'm just interested to know more, you know, what are the values, why do you think this way? What are the things that are important to you? So I think that was always my attitude. Like, and I was definitely not a missionary mindset, which I think was actually true for most of the Peace Corps people I taught with. Like, there's different moments in the Peace Corps, but the time that we went there in 1996, I think it was less likely for Americans to feel like we have to put American values on this place or something. I mean, we were all quite open. And it was more personal. It was like, I'm not here, I was conscious of the fact that people saw me as a representative of the U.S. society, but I didn't feel like I was a propagandist or I'm here to push a certain agenda. It was much more personal what I was interested in China. And so I think that helped. But yeah, I try to think that I don't have tons of prejudices basically. And the first, if you read Rivertown, there's a lot of descriptions of mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes, not the same as prejudices, but just things that we didn't understand that took a while to figure out. You'd say the wrong thing, you would do the wrong thing. Um, and that was very common. It was less common when I went back in 2019 because by that point I was fairly comfortable in China.
So, my next question, or from the audience, is uh, a question about writing nonfiction. Do you plan ahead what to write? Like, you have a plot in your mind, or you just go with what materials you have in hand?
Well, I mean, the first step is gathering the material. And so while I'm gathering material, I don't really think that much about the writing, to be honest. I mean, your first project is just to record as much as you can. You don't know what you're going to need or how you're going to structure it. You can't tell until you're done with the research. And so I was very fortunate. It's kind of amazing to think of this, but I showed the pictures of the Peace Corps volunteers, 15 of us or 14 of us who showed up in 1996. Only two of us brought computers. That's how, almost nobody brought a computer to China. It was me and one other guy. I brought a laptop. And that made a huge difference. Of course, I couldn't get online, but I was able to take notes about stuff. And so when my students wrote papers that I found really interesting, I would transcribe them on my computer. If I went out into town and had an interesting conversation, I would keep it in my journal. So I did that the whole time I was on FuLing. I actually didn't have a plan to write a book. I thought I was too young. I was just recording these things because it interested me. And I thought, maybe someday you'll write different things about what it was like to be here. So you might as well keep all this material. So it wasn't really until about 6 months to go in my time in FuLing that my writing teacher from Princeton named John McPhee, a great nonfiction writer, he wrote me a long letter and he said, you should really think about writing a book about what you've been doing and about this place. I think what he wrote, he said, FuLing is a book. I'd been sending him letters, and so he knew what I was doing. And it was interesting because I hadn't thought about it, but once I read his letter, um, almost immediately I started to think about it and said, yeah, maybe this is something that makes sense. Maybe I can do this. And so I went back through my notes and I looked at what I had been recording and I could see my material. And then I thought about the gaps. I've got 6 months left. What are some of the things that I could use to write whatever book I'm going to write? And so for the last 6 months, I would go like to certain parts of the city and research things, talk to people, write descriptions of landscapes and the rivers, and just so that I had all of my material. So I was thinking about the book, but not in the sense of structure or what's going to come first, what chapter, whatever. And it wasn't until I left FuLing and I went back to Missouri and went back to my parents' home that I started to write. And at that point, of course, yes, I looked through my material and I developed a structure. I had, ideas for each chapter. And I wrote the first draft of the book. I ended up making some changes, but the first draft was pretty similar to the way it turned out.
Okay, thank you. So I have one last question, and then we'll move to like audience. So there are a lot of people, I think more than 10 people. They're waiting to, ask questions to you like directly. So my last ending question is, since you have taught like two generations of students in China, what are like the difference have you noticed about their openness to like Western ideology? Like, are they more open to Western ideology now, or were they open about it before? Like, what is like the key difference that you noticed after you taught two generations there?
Yeah. I mean, of course, the universities are different, right? When I taught in FuLing, that was what they would call a 专科学校, it's basically kind of like a junior college. It was a 3-year university. It was pretty low on Chinese higher education, whereas when I went to Sichuan University, that's what they would call a 985 or 985 university, which is a pretty elite university. So I was at a more elite place when I went back. But at the same time, even in FuLing in 1996, it was so hard to get into university that the students were almost elite, even if they weren't from elite backgrounds, but you had to be really good to make it into even a place like FuLing. Um, but having said that, I mean, I think it was true that the students I taught in Sichuan University in Chengdu, they were quite open and they were very familiar with Western ideas. They were quite open. Many of the values like as I said, like their attitudes, it was interesting. Like I would do debates in class, and one point I thought, well, maybe we can have a debate about gay marriage. Like, should gay marriage be legal in China? And so I asked my Sichuan University, a group of freshmen, do you believe, I just anonymously asked them, do you believe that gay marriage should be legal? Because I thought maybe we have a debate about this. Should it be legal in China? And like about 80% of them said yes. So I didn't even do the debate. It was like, this is, it's so lopsided. And that really surprised me. Because when I asked the same question for my FuLing students in one of my surveys, it was the exact opposite. It was like 75, 80% said no. And my Sichuan University students often said this was a big difference with their parents. They said they're very close-minded about LGBTQ issues. Like they're not the same as us. So you notice things like that. I also noticed, the students at Sichuan University were often, they could be positive about democracy and about some of the political values that you had in places like Canada or China or the United States, but they often said it doesn't work in China. It's not appropriate for us. Like we can't have that system here. That is a very common response, and you hear that a lot from educated Chinese, not just young people, but also, educated people who are very familiar with things. They often say, "Yeah, it's great for those places, but it wouldn't work here." That's a very common response I found.
Thank you for your answers. I see two people already raising their hands. So
Thank
I think, Young, do you want to take over?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Ajita. Thank you very much, Peter, Faye, and Ed. Before we open the mic for our audience, Peter, can I ask you a question? Like, you, what is your experience and your reflection on how to manage this culture difference and the political conflict? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, this is a very distressing time. It's very sad. I mean, the Peace Corps was shut down actually in 2020 during in January of 2020, the Trump administration ended that program, which was really a tragedy. It had been an incredibly good program. It was good for China, but it was also really good for the United States. I mean, they trained a whole lot of people like me who knew nothing about China, and we became people who worked in China. A number of other people became journalists. There were people who became diplomats working with China. There were people who went into business. So this was a program that was incredibly valuable for the United States. And the Trump administration killed it, and for no good reason. They said, "Oh, we shouldn't be helping China," and it wasn't really. I mean, it was helping America as much as it was helping China. But this has been true for all kinds of exchanges, right? I mean, during this period, that's been a huge cost. We ended the Fulbright program to China, and so we're losing a generation of China experts. And I look at my own experience, like I was very lucky. I showed up in China without knowing anything at the age of 27. 2 years later, I was writing my first book, and 3 years later, I was a correspondent for the New Yorker magazine. It completely shaped my career. And it was possible, though it was quite open at that time. You could make that kind of path. That's pretty much impossible now for a young American. It's very hard to get a journalist visa in China right now, so it'd be hard. I don't think I could live there as a journalist right now. I couldn't get the visa basically, or if I did, it would take maybe a year, 2 years. It's very uncertain. So all of this I find very distressing, and I find it sad that, fewer young Americans are engaging with China. It's one of the reasons why I make sure that my daughters are keeping up their language, because I think that we don't have enough people here who speak Chinese, and that's a special skill, and I want them to have it. I think it's going to be useful for them later.
So do you have wide connections with Chinese Americans here? And do you feel, because I know many Chinese immigrants now fear about this anti-Chinese racism in the face of this conflict between the United States and China.
Yeah.
Do you have any observation or thought on this?
I mean, obviously it's an issue, right? And I know people who have been attacked. I mean, there was a journalist I worked, a Chinese journalist that I knew from back when I was in Beijing who was attacked viciously in the Bay Area and ended up in the hospital. No reason for the attack other than that he was Asian, Chinese. It hasn't affected my wife and kids here. I think, we're in rural Colorado and it's not the same. I think those things probably happen more in cities. So they haven't felt this personally. But we're aware that it's different, for many people in America. There was especially a problem during the pandemic, this sort of anti-Asian feeling. So it's just, this is a sad moment in a lot of ways, and that's one of the sources of sadness.
Mhm. And do you have any suggestions to immigrants here, like how to keep that balance between cultural assimilation and keeping their own heritage? Um,
Yeah, I mean it is hard, and that's very different from what I did. I mean, I was never an immigrant to China, right? I was always working there, but I always knew that my permanent home was in the US. And so in a way, I think that also made it easier for me not to take things personally, right? Because I'm just like, okay, if they treat me like a Lawai or Waigoran, that's what I am. And, I'm not committed to this society in the same way that an immigrant is. It's much harder if you're making a new life and you're making a new world. I do think that my wife Leslie's parents handled that quite well when she was a child. It's very hard, they had been born in the Dalu in China, and then they went to Taiwan in 1949. So they're the kind of people that you would call Waishengran, who had been born in the mainland, but they grew up in Taiwan, and then they went to America as graduate students. So it's kind of an amazing generation because they were uprooted multiple times. They fled as children from mainland China to Taiwan, and then as graduate students, they went to the United States and they made a new life there. So I think that really informed their approach. They were quite flexible. They were happy that their children were becoming American, but they also made sure that they remembered their connection to China. That was very important to them. And so Leslie and her brother both grew up speaking Chinese very well. And so I think that is a hard thing for immigrants to do. It's interesting. A lot of educated Chinese have been quite good about doing this. And it's partly, again, education. Like they would often set up schools. Like in Leslie's community in Westchester, New York, there was a Chinese school that she went to every Saturday, and her mother taught in the school. People would be very committed to this. So that tradition of education also allowed them to maintain their language and the culture. And yeah, no, I think it's, if you can find a way to do that, it really is good for the child. But of course, it's hard. It takes a big commitment on the part of the parents.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll open the floor for our audience if they wish to talk to you directly. Ajita, could you please look at the who is raise their hand? Yeah, please raise.
We have already
Oh,
unmute
all right.
Stella. She
Yeah.
will be the next one to
Yeah.
ask a question.
Hi, good evening, Peter. I hope you can hear me. This is Stella.
Mhm.
If you want to turn on my video, I'm happy to turn on my end as well. So, Peter, I went to university in China in 1987, came to Canada in 2001. I picked up your first book, Rivertown, in 2007. It was recommended to me by a French Canadian. And I have since read all your books except the last one. I'm working on the last one right now.
Okay.
I want to first off let you know how much your book had helped me and inspired me. And at the time when I read Rivertown, I was trying to learn French because I needed the language skill to be able to work and function in Montreal. And I think it was the struggle that I experienced that made my colleague, my boss at the time, who recommended your book to me. And I want to let you know that you're writing about your experience in a totally foreign country, trying to pick up the language while trying to do your job inspired me a lot. And I also read a lot of the sort of the life I had back in China at a time when sort of you were writing about your students. So there's a very interesting dynamic when I read your book. And the two books after that, I felt like I was trying to keep up with what's going on in China through your eyes. And there's three things I really appreciate in your writing: your ability to observe, your willingness to go and immerse your life sort of in the life of the locals, including how in your one of the recent book in Egypt, how you become friend with, the garbage collector of your building. It was really exceptional, just your ability to connect with the local people and learn about their way of life through very genuine interest in their lives and how you conduct yourself. I wanted to kind of just tag on to what Yang had just mentioned about immigrants, whether it's Chinese American or Chinese Canadian. I wonder if you would ever pick up some interest in writing about the lives of those, kind of leverage your life experience in China, in Egypt, and pick up some of the life stories of some of us here, especially in the current environment, and help the audience on this side of the world to understand about China, about the dynamics, and to your point about we're losing a generation of people being able to know about the other side. I think it's really a big hindrance to how the relationship's going to be between China, Chinese people, and American people, and Canadians likewise. So wanted to hear a little bit about your perspective, your next project, and would you ever be interested in picking up some of the stories like this? Thank you. Big
Yeah,
fan.
thank you. Thank you very much. It's very nice of you. Yeah, I mean, I did actually, I wrote a story in the New Yorker maybe a little more than a year ago about Chinese students in the US during this time. And I followed some of it was based on students I had taught in Chengdu and sort of watching what their experience was like as they came to the US during this very complicated time. And it was fascinating and also, quite sobering because it's a big challenge and they're aware of the tensions and they're often in places where they're dealing with things like crime, that they wouldn't be dealing with in China. And it was sort of fascinating. I mean, a couple of them became big gun guys. They bought a lot of guns and they felt like that was necessary to protect themselves in the US. It's actually I've had several students who did that when they came here. So I have written some about that. I'm sure in the future there'll be stories that I come across like that. Right now I'm actually working on a memoir, so a book more about something in my past. So I had always planned that when I was here, when my daughters were in high school, that this was a project I would do now because I'm not in a position now to go back to China, right? So it's kind of I can go back for visits, I think. I'm not sure, but I think, but you can't really live there now for lots of reasons, and I can't live there as a journalist. So my next project is not a China-based project. But I do expect that I'll run into China stories as I go. And I think that eventually I'll live in China again. I'm just not sure when. Thank you.
Okay, so I think Arthur is next. I've unmuted.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Thank you very much. I have read your books on China years ago when I just came to Canada from China, from Shanghai actually, and I share a lot of similar experiences with your students because I was born in a mountainous village in China, and then I went to college in 2000 in the English major, and
Mm.
then I just made a livelihood out of teaching English in future, and then
And
also
and
because
where were you born? Which province were you in?
yeah, I was born in Henan in
In Henan.
Xinyang,
Oh,
the
okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
southernmost place in Henan.
I've
Yeah.
been there. Yeah, I've been to Xinyang. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, it's a mountainous place,
yeah.
and so I also because of my major in English, I emigrated to Canada in 2016, and I have been living here since then. But going back twice to visit my parents and my in-laws. Um, so this is what I want to share with you. So because of my experience, I have a very special impression on your books because I found a lot of similarities between me and your students who are maybe a couple of years older than me. And I have two questions. The first is about writing. I feel that most of your books on China, they are actually the inspirations when you were living in diaspora. So you are an observer in another place, in a foreign country, out of your hometown. And it seems that you wrote more on places outside your hometown, and you wrote not much on your hometown. So I want to know um, what's your uh, what's your understanding of the impact of your hometown and the impact of you living in diaspora? I mean, the impact of those experiences on your writing. Um, and also, it's another question, but related to this one, that is like, have you ever encouraged your students to write their stories, to write their life? And do you think, um, I mean, like, do you think you should encourage them to write just like your Princeton professor encouraged you years ago, or you think probably they are not the materials of becoming writers? Okay,
Mhm.
and this is the first question. It's about writing. I mean, like the writing, the relationship between hometown, diaspora, and writing. And second, do you think like you should encourage other people to turn to writing, not as a profession, but maybe as a hobby or as
Mhm.
a kind of like um, uh, as a kind of like a pursuit beside their profession or career or livelihood. And the second question is um, um, like the status quo in America, has the status quo in America changed your impression on your home country, and also has it changed your impression on China?
Okay. Well, to answer the first question, I mean, I grew up in a fairly small place in mid-Missouri. I think I had a feeling when I was in college that where I came from was not interesting, that it was provincial and it was not important, and that I needed to find if I was going to become a writer, I had to go far from home. The writer Paul Theroux, he was also a Peace Corps volunteer. He was in the 1960s and he became a writer. And he's written about this that, it was important for him as a writer to leave home. And I think that was true for me too. Like I had to go far. And that's sort of what opened up my vision, and I broke ties to where I was from and changed my perspective. And so it was very critical for me to do that. So I was very much aware of that as a young person. But now finally I'm writing something about my hometown. So 30 years later, I'm looking back at that place and writing something about it. But I think it was important for me to write elsewhere. Your other question was about my students and encouraging them. Actually, I encouraged all of my students to try to keep journals and to record what they're experiencing. Because if you don't write it down, you don't remember. And people often don't realize this. And I mean, it's amazing how much material I still have from FuLing. I still have so many diaries and journals, and I use them all the time in my writing. I go back and I look at things and I have quotes and I have details. I'm very grateful that I recorded. Of course, I'm a writer, so that became my job. But even if I had not been a writer, if I had gone on to do something else, I would have been very happy that I recorded these things. So I always told my students at Sichuan University, try to keep a journal, try to keep some kind of record of what's going on. And it doesn't matter if you publish it or not, but it will help you process the world around you. I do have a couple of students who are writing more professionally, and I do what I can to encourage them, and I read what they're writing and give them feedback. So that is important. Um, and then your last question was about what? I can't hear if the microphone is muted. Okay.
Sorry. It's about the status quo in America. Has it changed your impression on America, and also has it changed your impression on China?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think it's a pretty depressing period right now. And um, I mean, I think for me, it started maybe after 9/11. I felt like you could see changes in America's view toward the outside world. There was sort of a new xenophobia, a new type of isolationism. I think what we're going through now is another stage of that. And it all began with that, in my opinion. And I think that the United States kind of lost its bearings. It lost its sort of its sense of how to deal with the outside world, and we've made one mistake after another, I think, since then, basically. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it's very depressing. And I felt like I was contributing to something with the Peace Corps that was more positive. And now I think that things like that don't matter as much anymore because people aren't interested in that kind of relationship with the outside world. I hope it changes eventually, but I think it's going to take time. And I think that this period will continue to be challenging.
Very much for your time today. It's interesting that you said that because you are from a small place in the US, so you thought it's not interesting to write about your story, so you had to go elsewhere and write about it. So I also had the same feeling. So and also wrote and published some short nonfictions on some other countries. So for me, it's really interesting. Recently, I read your book about Egypt, The Buried, and so it's a very interesting structure for me because on one side you have the storyline of ancient Egypt, and you're trying to depict some of the past of the Egypt history, and on the other side, you're also very close to the reality in Egypt at the time. So this is a very interesting structure for me in this book. So could you just talk a little bit more about how you come up with this structure while you were living in Egypt? I know that at that time you were also writing about New Yorker and probably some other media. So did you like slowly come up with this structure after being exposed to different people and
Yeah.
events at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly because I was interested in both things. I was interested in contemporary Egypt, and what was going on with the Arab Spring and in society. I was interested in people like Said, the garbage man that I wrote about. But I was also very interested in ancient Egypt, and I spent a lot of time with archaeologists and learning about that. I found it really fascinating. So I had both of these interests, but I also noticed that people never did them together. It's sort of ancient Egypt is one thing and contemporary Egypt is something else, and there's no connection between them. And to me, that seemed artificial because I think there's lots of connections, and it doesn't mean that it's the same. Of course, many things change, and Egypt is different from China, right? Because in China, the language never changed, right? So the writing, if you look at the Jaguan and you look at oracle bones, you can recognize that those are Chinese characters. That's Chinese writing. Whereas, Egyptians write in Arabic now. They look at the hieroglyphs. They can't read them. So you do have a different relationship with the past, but there is still a relationship. And so I was really fascinated in that, and I thought it would be interesting to write about them both at the same time. Also, I just felt like there were a lot of if you look at ancient Egypt, it's very sophisticated politically, actually. Many of the things that ancient Egyptians did in terms of politics, also in terms of culture, like developing a meaningful faith, a meaningful religion, developing a sense of what it means to be Egyptian. It's fascinating how early they were able to do this, like, 2500, 2800 BC. And many of the techniques that they use are the same techniques that people use now, right? Um, there was even I described there was a term in ancient Egypt called wehem meset, which means, it's kind of like a renaissance. And so often when a pharaoh came to power, he would say, we've got to go back to the way things used to be, to the when it was everything was good. And it's just basically the same thing as Make America Great Again, this kind of political nostalgia. It's very effective political tool to say we need to go back. We need to go back to when we were great. And so there are lots of connections like that. You realize that there are certain human instincts and human tendencies that have not changed a whole lot in 4,000 years. There's lots of things that have changed, of course, but there's other things that haven't. And even this interest in the very strong male leader, right? The pharaoh or the strong man who's going to lead your country. We still, are kind of subject to that. As much as we would like to think that we've changed, you see it all over the world. We see it in the United States right now, right? And you see it in China right now. You see it in Egypt right now. So it's somewhat universal. And so I was thinking about those things, and I wanted to combine them in a book that thought about some of these issues.
Yeah, that's a great idea actually, and the interesting thing is that a lot of these events or the mindsets that you described in the book, I know that they would probably be described in a negative way among some Chinese audience, because
Hmm.
that's how, like in the Chinese, like Chinese speaking world, how some people would
Mm.
discuss about this kind of things in Egypt. But
Mm.
on the other side, I feel that you really showed a lot of empathy on the people, like how they feel, how they live, and not without judging them from any of the maybe pre-established perspective. So do you think this kind of empathy is very important in your writing? It's probably natural for you, but I feel that's something that's missing from maybe some Chinese authors.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to be open to their world. I'm not, it's not interesting for me to just judge people. It's more interesting to explain why they have these values or why they think this way, why they have this opinion. That to me is interesting, but it's not interesting for me to define them in some negative way or to criticize them. I think that's less dynamic and less useful also to the reader. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
So our last audience is Don Yu. I'm gonna unmute.
Oh, hi, Peter. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting, your life stories. My question is, in the 90s, when you graduated from prestigious Princeton University and then try to find adventures in China, at that time, I was trying my best to go to the United States, the number one world power in the global scales. So now we all probably at the same life stages. Um, your life is a process that many of us envy and admire, but also not very familiar with most of the overseas Chinese because we always try to looking for a stable life in the in the environment like the U.S. and Canada. And can you uh, share with us to be a writer and a journalist and moving around from China to Africa, Egypt. How is life like that? Is it stable? Do you have to write a certain amount of articles each week in order to uh, maintain a lifestyle that you can live up with? Because I think our next generation probably is more open to the life as you are experienced now, looking for the adventure, looking for the life that fulfill their dreams. And but for us, we are really that kind of environment. So I want to see if you have some insight. It's stable. It's what kinds of journey it is.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
thank you. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I was probably lucky in that my parents were not very, my parents didn't have very much money, so I didn't have expectations actually in terms of how much money I had. So it wasn't very important to me actually. And my parents, they didn't that when I went to Princeton, they didn't care if I became a banker or venture capital guy or something and made a fortune. That wasn't what they were interested in. They're very simple people in that sense. So they were very happy when I joined the Peace Corps. They thought that was a great thing to do. So I was lucky because actually at a university like Princeton, you often feel this competitive pressure from the other students that you have to do something that's prestigious. And I didn't really feel that. And so joining the Peace Corps was not prestigious, but I thought it would probably be good for me and I wanted to be a writer. And I thought that if you're going to be a writer, you should have an interesting life. And I felt that even if I failed as a writer, if I had an interesting life, that would be a valuable thing. So that was always my priority. That was what I cared about. And, it turned out that I was fortunate for a couple of reasons. One is that when I started journey, I was in FuLing for those 2 years, and then I wrote my first book. And that first book, it sold to a publisher, not for a huge amount of money, but it was enough that I could pay off my college loans, for example. So then I didn't have any debt, and
Wow.
I decided, okay, I'll go back to China and just try to become a writer. So that really helped give me the confidence to move to Beijing, and where I didn't know anybody and I didn't know who I was going to write stories for. And Beijing was very cheap at that time. I mean, I think my first apartment, I think I was paying $300 a month for an apartment in Beijing in 1999. I mean, it was not a very nice apartment, but it was perfectly fine. And I spent all of my time outside talking to people anyway, so I didn't really care about the apartment. So, and also at that time, journalism was healthy. Like I wrote for all kinds of American newspapers. There were so many American papers were interested in having a story from China. I can remember like the Seattle newspaper would contact me and say, "Can you write a story about this?" And I would go do it. And they paid me pretty well. It was very easy to make a living, actually. So I feel badly for young writers now because it's much harder. It's so much harder to make a living. So I was lucky. And of course, if I had had a family, I would have felt a lot of stress, but I didn't marry until later. And by the time I got married and had children, I had already, my kids were born around the time that my third book was published. So I was already pretty stable and, I'd saved up some money. And so I was fine financially. So I actually never felt a lot of financial pressure as a writer, which is unusual, I think. And it's also my timing was good. I went to China at a time when people cared about China, and people read the books that I wrote about China. They bought them, and so I recognize that it's a very unusual experience. And when I give advice to young people today, it's always a little bit hard because the path that I took is not open in the same way. Partly political, like it's hard to go to China as a young writer now. It's just hard to get visas and all of that. But it's also very hard professionally. There's not the same number of newspapers and magazines. Even the books, the reading public has really changed a lot. So it makes me a little sad. Also because my daughters are very good writers, actually. They like to write. It's something they're good at, but I have trouble seeing what their path would be, you know. If they want to do it, I'll encourage them. But it's not going to be the same path that I took.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I think that will be the last audience to ask you questions. I jumped away because if people wish to join our WeChat group, they can my background. There's a QR code for our WeChat. Then there you can find all our events. And Peter, thank you, and we wish that continue with you. Hopefully,
Yeah,
even
no,
more
yeah,
is the whole world coming back to the right track.
yeah, no, I hope so too. And thank you very much for having me. And it was impressive to see so many people take an interest. And
you,
yeah, no,
you're,
I hope that eventually we come to a better place
mhm,
with
yeah,
U.S.-China relations and
and
in
you're
relation.
a hero to many of us. You are really a hero, an endearing hero. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for making time. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for your interest.
Thanks to Ed, Faye for asking
Yeah,
Peter those
yeah,
questions.
yeah.
And
Thank you very much for the thoughtful questions. Yeah.
yeah, and our volunteers. Thank you so much. And yeah, let's look forward to the future.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Have a
everybody.
good evening.
Night.
For inquiries, please contact info@eawlc.org or visit our website at www.eawlc.org.